The rain had been falling for 3 straight days when the stranger came walking up the muddy road to the Fletcher homestead, and Adeline Fletcher, 34 years old and a widow for 11 long months, watched him through the streaked window glass with her late husband's rifle resting within arm's reach. He was tall, or he had been once, before hunger had folded him inward. His coat hung off his shoulders like it had been cut for a bigger man. He walked slow, favoring his right leg, carrying nothing but a battered canvas sack and the kind of tiredness that settles all the way into the bone. Adeline did not go to the door. In the 11 months since she had buried Daniel, her husband slipping away quiet in his sleep one bitter January night, the fever finally taking him after it had circled the whole of Elk Fork all winter, she had learned that a woman alone on a dying ranch could not afford to be soft with strangers who came out of the rain. But she could not afford to be cruel, either, and there was something in the way the man stopped at the very edge of her yard, hat already in his hands, waiting to be seen rather than pushing himself forward, that made her lift her hand off the cold iron of the rifle. She opened the door a bare hand's width. "That's far enough," she called out over the drum of the rain. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was rough, like a thing gone unused. "I don't mean you any trouble. I saw the smoke off your chimney from the ridge road. I've been walking 2 days now with nothing in me." He swallowed hard. "I'll work for it. Whatever you've got that needs doing. Fences, firewood, that barn roof, I can see sagging from here. I'll work for food. That's all I'm asking of you." And what Adeline Fletcher said next would surprise her for the rest of her days. Because she had been standing at that window for 11 months, watching her entire world come apart one gray board at a time. The note on the ranch was 3 payments behind. The well pump had cracked in the last freeze. Her boy Thomas, only 9 years old, had been trying to split wood with an axe nearly as tall as he was, and she had heard him crying about it in the barn when he thought no one could hear. She was so tired that her tiredness had its own weight, like a second body she carried through every hour. So the words came up out of her before good sense could catch them. "I don't need a ranch hand," Adeline said, and her voice cracked right down the middle. "I've got 3 children in this house and 160 acres I can't hold alone, and every man in this county looks at me like a widow's land is theirs for the taking." She pulled in a breath that shook. "I don't need a ranch hand, mister. I need a husband for these children. I need a father for them. That's the only work I've got left worth offering." The rain kept falling. The man stood there in the yard, water running off the brim of the hat in his 2 hands, and for a long moment he did not say one word. She was certain he would turn and walk back down the road, and she would never forgive herself for the foolishness of what she had let slip. But he didn't move. His name, he told her once she had let him stand dripping in the doorway, was Elias Crane, and he was 39 years old. He had come up from the Kansas line, and before that from a good deal of places he did not seem to want to name. He had the look of a man who had lost something so large he'd stopped trying to carry the shape of it, and had simply set it down on some road behind him and kept walking. Adeline fed him first. Whatever she'd said in the doorway, she was not the sort of woman who could watch a person go hungry in her own kitchen, and so she set before him a bowl of bean soup and a heel of bread, and she watched him make himself eat it slow when every muscle in him clearly wanted to fall on it like an animal. The children came out one at a time to look at him, the way children do. Thomas came first, 9 and solemn, and trying so hard to be the man of the house that it broke his mother's heart daily. Then Ruth, 7, with her father's dark eyes and a rag doll clutched under one arm. And last, little Caleb, 4 years old, who had been barely 3 when his father passed, and who had already, Adeline feared, begun to forget the sound of Daniel's voice. Caleb walked straight up to the strange man at the table, looked at him a long while, and then held up his arms to be picked up. Elias Crane went very still. And Adeline saw the thing she would think about for years afterward. She saw a grown man's hands begin to tremble as he reached down and lifted her youngest boy onto his knee, careful as if the child were made of blown glass, as if he had forgotten a body could hold something that small and warm and living. That was the moment Adeline knew he would stay. She didn't know yet what it would cost either of them to find out why. They were married 11 days later, in the front room, by a traveling preacher who did not ask too many questions and accepted a hot meal in place of a fee. It was not a marriage of the kind the songs are written about. There were no flowers, no vows dressed up in poetry. Adeline wore her one good dress, gray wool gone thin at the cuffs. Elias wore a shirt that had been Daniel's, because his own was past saving, and Adeline had held that shirt a long moment before she handed it over, and neither of them said a thing about it. They stood a careful arm's length apart when the preacher joined their hands. That night, Elias took his blankets out to the barn and slept there, and he went on sleeping there for a long while after, and neither one of them spoke of it. It was an arrangement, a roof for him, and for her a pair of shoulders strong enough to keep the roof from coming down on her children's heads. That was the bargain, plain and honest, and both of them meant to keep to it. But bargains between good people have a way of growing into something their makers never planned. Because Elias Crane, it turned out, could not do a thing by halves. He mended the sagging barn roof in 4 days, hauling himself up into the rain-swollen timbers and working till the light gave out. He rebuilt the fence line along the north pasture where the winter had knocked it flat. He got down into the cracked well and worked the pump loose and coaxed it back to drawing sweet water, and when the first cold gush came up out of the pipe, little Ruth clapped her hands and laughed, and something in the man's weathered face cracked open at the sound. And he taught Thomas how to split wood. Adeline watched it from the kitchen window one gold afternoon, the tall, quiet man kneeling in the dirt beside her 9-year-old, guiding the boy's hands on the axe handle, showing him where to set his feet, how to let the weight of the tool do the work instead of fighting it. She watched Thomas sink the blade clean through a round of pine on the first true swing. She watched her boy look up at Elias, with a light in his face she had not seen there since his father died. She had to sit down at the table. She pressed her apron to her mouth, so the children would not hear their mother weeping over something that looked, from the outside, so much like nothing at all. What she did not know was that the hardest test of their strange new family was still riding toward them down the ridge road. His name was Harlan Voss, and he owned the biggest spread in Elk Fork County, near 4,000 head of cattle, and the ear of every man who mattered at the bank in town. He was 61 years old, hard as a fence post, and he had wanted the Fletcher land for a good 3 years, because a spring ran through its low pasture that never went dry even in the worst of August, and Harlan Voss had lost more cattle to dry summers than he cared to count. He had made Daniel Fletcher an offer once, and Daniel had turned him down flat, and Harlan Voss was not a man who forgot being turned down. So when word reached him that the widow Fletcher had gone and married some drifter off the road, he rode out himself to see it, and he found Elias Crane repairing the corral gate in his shirt sleeves in the noon sun. "You'd be the new husband," Voss said, not getting down off his horse. "I would," said Elias. "Then you'll want to hear me plain." Voss leaned on his saddle horn. "That woman's note is 3 payments behind at the bank, and I hold paper on half the debts in this county, including hers. Come the 1st of the month, I can call that note due whenever it pleases me to, or," and here the old man's voice turned smooth as creekstone, "you can save yourself the winter. I'll pay a fair price for the land and the water on it, and you can take your new bride and her brood, somewhere the living's easier. A man with sense knows when he's been handed a losing hand." Elias Crane set down his hammer. He looked up at the old man on the tall horse for a long, level moment. "I've been handed a losing hand near my whole life, Mr. Voss," he said quietly. "First time I've held one worth keeping. We're not selling." And Harlan Voss rode off with his jaw set like flint, and everyone who knew him knew that meant trouble was coming. But trouble, as it happened, was not the only thing riding toward the Fletcher place that season. The truth about Elias Crane came out on a night in early autumn, when a hard frost had settled, and Adeline could not sleep, and went out to the barn to bring the man an extra blanket. A small kindness, nothing more, or so she told herself. She found him awake, sitting up in the lantern light, and on the boards beside him lay a small tintype photograph he had taken from that battered canvas sack he'd carried up her road all those weeks ago. She did not mean to look, but she saw a woman, 2 small children. "They passed," Elias said, before she could speak, his voice very low and steady, in the way of a man who has said a thing over so many times inside his own head that saying it aloud no longer breaks him, though it once nearly did. 6 years back, the fever came through our town, same as it came through yours. It took the 3 of them inside a single week, and it left me." He was quiet a moment. "It went easy on them, at the last. The doctor swore to me they slipped off gentle, in their sleep, and I've had to make myself believe that, or I couldn't have kept walking." Adeline stood in the barn door with the blanket in her arms, and did not move. "I've been walking ever since," Elias went on. 6 years. Couldn't stay any place. Couldn't look at a child without—" His voice caught, and he stopped, and started again. "When your little one held his arms up to me that first day, I near came apart on your kitchen floor. I told myself I'd stay the winter, work off the debt of a warm meal. I never meant to," he looked up at her at last, "I never meant to start loving them. Or you. I didn't think I had it left in me to do." Adeline crossed the barn floor. She sat down beside him in the straw and the lantern light, and she took his rough, scarred hand in both of hers, and for the first time since either of them had buried the loves of their earlier lives, neither one was alone in the dark with it. "Then don't stop," she whispered. That was the night the bargain became a marriage, and it could not have come a day too soon, for the frost that had brought her to the barn was the first breath of the hardest winter Elk Fork had seen in 20 years. The snow came early and it came deep. It buried the fence lines Elias had mended, and it froze the creeks, and it kept the whole county pinned indoors and hungry-eyed toward spring. And on the worst night of that winter, a rider came pounding up the buried road to the Fletcher place, one of Harlan Voss's hands, half frozen to his saddle, because the old man had gone out at dusk to move stock ahead of the storm, and his horse had come back to the barn without him. Every soul in Elk Fork knew what a night like that one did to a man caught out in it alone. Elias Crane did not hesitate. He pulled on Daniel Fletcher's old coat, and he saddled the strongest horse in the barn, and Adeline stood in the doorway, with the wind screaming past her, and said, "That man would have taken everything from us." And Elias said, "That doesn't change what he needs tonight." And he rode out into the white. He found Harlan Voss 2 miles out, pinned under a horse that had gone down in a drift, both of them near frozen through. And Elias Crane got the old man free, and got him up across his own saddle, and walked the both of them the long 2 miles home, through snow to his waist, because the horse could not carry them both. They laid Harlan Voss by the fire in the Fletcher front room, and Adeline packed warm cloths around him through the night, and the children carried wood, and by the gray light of morning, the old man's eyes came open, and the first thing they fell upon was the widow he had tried to ruin, spooning warm broth for the man who had refused to sell him her land, both of them having sat up the whole night through to keep a stranger's heart beating. Harlan Voss did not say anything for a long time. But something in him, some frozen old thing that had been packed hard as winter ground for 30 years, had begun, very quietly, to thaw. He stayed 4 days, until the roads cleared enough to carry him home. And in those 4 days a strange thing happened in that small warm house. Little Caleb took to crawling up into the fearsome old man's lap, the way he had once climbed into Elias's, and Ruth showed him her rag doll, and Thomas, shy at first, ended up sitting at his knee, listening to stories of the county from before there was a town in it at all. Harlan Voss had buried his own wife 2 decades back and had never had children, and he had spent all the long years since building a kingdom of cattle and grudges, and had never once, in all that time, been climbed on by a 4-year-old who had decided, for no reason at all, to trust him. When his hand came at last to fetch him home, Harlan Voss stood in the doorway of the Fletcher place, leaning on a cane, for the cold had left his legs stiff, and he looked at Elias Crane for a long, hard moment. "The note," he said gruffly, "at the bank. I bought it up months back, meaning to call it due and squeeze you off this ground." He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper, and he held it out. "It's marked paid, in full. Don't argue with me about it. I haven't the patience." Adeline's hand flew to her mouth. "A man showed me something out in that snow," Voss went on, gruff as ever, but not quite able to keep the roughness in his voice from breaking, "that I'd forgot a person could be shown. I've got more land than I'll ever ride across, and not one living soul who'd have come out in that storm for me. You did, owing me nothing, meaning to lose everything by it." He set his jaw. "The water in your low pasture. I'll not trouble you for it again, but if it wouldn't be an imposition, I'd be glad of a chair at your table now and again. It's been a long while since I sat at one that had children at it." And so the man who had ridden out to take everything came, in the end, to give it back, and found, at a widow's crowded table, the one thing his 4,000 cattle had never once bought him. They kept the Fletcher place. Spring came, as spring always does, and the creeks ran full off the mountain, and Elias Crane put in the first real crop that land had seen in 2 years, with Thomas working the field beside him, now near tall enough to be called a young man. Adeline stood at the kitchen window one warm evening and watched her husband, for he was her husband true now, in every way the word can mean, walking up from the low pasture, with Caleb riding high on his shoulders and Ruth swinging on his hand, and old Harlan Voss coming along slow behind them with his cane, having ridden out again for supper as he did most weeks now, and she thought about the rain-soaked man who had once stopped at the very edge of her yard and offered to work for food. She thought about the words that had come up out of her in that doorway, the foolish, desperate words she had been so sure she would regret. "I don't need a ranch hand. I need a husband for these children." She had been wrong about only one thing, she decided, watching them come up through the gold evening light, all of them laughing at something she could not hear. She had asked for a father for her children, and a pair of strong shoulders to hold up a failing roof. What had come walking up her road out of the rain was so much more than that, a whole heart, cracked and mended and given over full, and a family stitched together not from blood, but from grace, out of 2 griefs that had each thought themselves the end of the story. It was not the life she had planned, but standing there in the warm doorway, watching them come home to her, Adeline Fletcher would not have traded it for any easier one in all the world. And that, she would tell her grandchildren many long years later, is the truest kind of love there is, not the kind that arrives when everything is whole, but the kind that walks up out of the rain, hat in its hands, and offers to work for food, and stays to raise a family it never once expected to find.